education is absolutely critical to Australian families and to Australian children. It makes a massive difference having accessible and affordable early childhood education. It makes a huge difference to community members and their families, and certainly to people in Wentworth. Affordable and high-quality childcare allows parents, and particularly women, to return to the workforce, contribute to the economy and boost productivity. As someone who at some stage of my life was dropping off 3 children at the same time to my local early education childcare up in Paddington, I couldn't have done it without them, and it was the confidence with which I could drop off my children, know that they would have a day of fulfilment, they would be safe, they would be learning, and then I could go and do my job, which I loved, was just absolutely integral both to my mental health, my ability to pay the bills, but also to the lives of my kids. Research from the University of Chicago and Stanford estimate between 20 to 40% of our rise in living standards since 1960s has been a direct result of increased female workforce participation, and so much of that has been about how can our children be looked after. But then let's not forget the demonstrable impact that great, high-quality early childhood education has on kids, because you see that from children participating in childcare, if you have those first years of a child's life is set up for success and they have high access to high-quality childcare, it improves language, motor skills and social skills during this absolutely critical time of their lives. This bill makes an important contribution to our childcare system by modifying the flawed activity test that determines the number of hours of subsidised childcare to recognise work, training or study for families. Under this legislation, families will have access to a guaranteed 3 days of care regardless of their activity. Now, let's just look at the context of this. This activity test was introduced in 2018, but ever since then, the activity test has been criticised. In particular, the Productivity Commission, in its most recent report, agreed that the activity test disproportionately impacted low-income families and kept children from disadvantaged backgrounds from fully receiving the benefits of the childcare system. Impact Economics estimates the number of low-income children to be around 126,000 children from the poorest households who are missing out on childcare. In particular, they could find no evidence that the activity test had the effect of increasing workforce participation. Now, that was the major argument for the activity test. In fact, research by the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee attested to the opposite, that the activity test complicated the system, created uncertainty around funding and impacted employment decisions around the margins, leading to a decrease in workforce participation. And I think that's the context we need to see this question on. The activity test was there to increase workforce participation. It appears it has done the opposite. The activity test is restricting access to high-quality early learning for kids from our most disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, we know the numbers. We know that the kids who are most likely to start school behind are those kids from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. Those are the ones that we need to be investing in the most to make sure that they start school with the skills that's going to allow them to succeed and can go through the school system with those skills. And that means having great access to high-quality early childhood education. That is why this activity test removal is so important. And that is why I'm supporting the bill. But I do want to acknowledge that we are working on the childcare system in this parliament, but I think there are some really fundamental issues with the entire system, and I think it is incumbent in this parliament, in the next term, whatever form it takes, to really fundamentally address them. And let's look at the numbers. Gross childcare fees in Australia are the 3rd highest in the OECD, and still the 7th highest after the inclusion of the CCS. Now, that sounds, that's statistics, right? When I go around my electorate, which is, an economically advantaged electorate, high childcare costs are stopping people having more children. And it's these are people, as I door knocked a young woman the other day. She's got 2 kids. Her family are really good earners. They've just bought a house. They've got great jobs, both her and her husband. They have 2 kids, and she said, "Look, we can't afford right now, despite earning literally both of them well into the 6 figures. We can't afford right now to have another child because of the cost of childcare." Now, if you are not receiving the childcare subsidy, you're spending around $60,000 post-tax income on childcare fees alone, and that's just for 3 days a week. Now, for families in my area, some of whom are really at the edges of the childcare subsidy, this is stopping them having more kids, and this is it's wrong that for families in our country that they have to choose not to have children because they can't afford to have the childcare. And it's also bad economics because we know that we've got a birth rate that is at record lows at 1.5. It's historically so low, but it's not a surprise given how much that childcare costs at the moment. And even with the subsidy, the average family in my electorate of Wentworth is still spending around $40,000 on out-of-pocket childcare fees to put 2 children into childcare just 4 days a week. Now, that goes up to $60,000 if they're not getting those childcare fees, which is talking about $100,000, $120,000 worth of income that is required to pay for childcare. Research by the New South Wales Productivity Commission shows that a 1% increase in fees paid by family led to a 0.16 fall in the number of hours worked by the primary carer, which in 80% of cases is the mother. And it's, as I said, it's no wonder that Australia's birth rate is so low. So when we look at the broader reforms we need to look at, we do need to look at, as well as how do we fund this, how do we make sure that we address childcare deserts, how do we increase access as we are looking to do through this removal of the activity test. We also need to look at really supply-side factors that are driving up the cost of childcare, which is then driving up the cost of childcare to Australian families. Now, when I talk to my local childcare centres, something that they tell me time and time again is that some of the quality and compliance that is put in place, which is there for good aims, good reasons, which is about maintaining quality for childcare, is actually turning to tick box that is not actually adding a lot of value, is just becoming an administrative burden, and in some cases they're actually pulling workers away from their kids because of all the sort of documentation and the pressure to provide parents with updates constantly through the day with photos and things like that. So there's some rods we've created for our own backs with parents getting all this information, but the system as it stands is making it more expensive and harder for childcare centres to offer high quality childcare, but at a price that is affordable to families and as well as a price that's affordable to the government. Similarly, when I talk to them about training in relation to early childhood education, speaking to a woman who had been involved in early childhood education as a nanny, for sort of 8 to 10 years, she had entered the training with a great desire to learn new skills and learn more about child development, and what she has spent her time doing is really learning against the compliance, and in a way that is neither really building her skills. It's it's ticking the boxes, but it's not building the skills. It's actually making it harder for her to continue on with her childcare education because she's earning a lower wage, but she's not feeling like she's actually building the skills. So I think we need to look at the education system, but also the compliance system, and saying how do we again make sure that these are well targeted to deliver the high quality but more affordable childcare into our country. And finally, we need to look at the complexity of the system for the parents. I've had numerous contacts from people in the community talking about the challenges in accessing the system, where young families are being caught out because they're unaware of the convention and necessity to apply for childcare positions when the child hasn't yet been born. I knew that after 12 weeks of 12 weeks of pregnancy, I was calling up all the childcare centres in my area and still really struggled to get get my children into the childcare centre. Families are seeing their hourly fees skyrocket well above the rate cap that's meant to be adjusted, and families are stuck and unaware of eligibility because the application process for childcare is archaic and complicated and inflexible. And again, I remember myself trying to apply for the CCS and finding it notoriously complex. And I'm well educated, happy to deal with government systems, but this is really a difficulty. And for people in my area, which is an area which is relatively well served for childcare compared to many parts of the country, the idea of shopping around for childcare is a joke because families are completely beholden to the availability of places and often just take whatever hours they can get, and that doesn't start to deal with shift workers and other complexity. So, while I do and I think we should celebrate each of the incremental steps in improving the childcare system as progress, I'll be honest, I think that we need to be honest to ourselves and say, history tells us the joy will be short-lived. I support the government's direction on childcare and believe the Productivity Commission's recommendations provide modest reprieve to working families, but I think we need to accept these modest changes, but we need to really look at a redesign of the system. I think we need to prioritise this issue in the next term of Parliament and work out how we can get better outcomes at an affordable price, both for families and for the taxpayer, because we've got to find, having such high childcare costs and early learning costs compared to other countries around the world is hurting families, and it is hurting the economy as well. And I think we are tinkering on the demand side, and I think we need to look at meaningful and substantive supply side reform. Thank you.